Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Unraveling Politics. This is a show where I discuss the news in politics of the week, and I provide my analysis in a way that everyone can understand. So we got a hefty dose of politics this past weekend. I'm sure you're aware of it. I'm not going to get into the whole story, but the assassination attempt on former President Trump's life was the big story of the week, really, and it really overpowers everything else I had planned leading up to this episode. I'm not going to get too much into it, like the blow by blow, no pun intended, because that has been reported in the media countless times over the last few days. So, the big news is Trump will still attend the Republican National Convention. The shooter was also under the rooftop of the building. The big iconic issue was Trump's fist in the air mouthing the word fight. That's going to be really of the election, probably the Trump campaign poster. It was, up until now, it was probably going to be the mugshot, but I would say that is probably going to be the big picture of the election from here on out. Of course, this is a response to the deep division within the country. This is the first presidential assassination this century. The first one in 40 years. The last one was in 1981, and that was against Ronald Reagan. And even then, Ronald Reagan wasn't running for president. The last time a candidate was killed was in 1968, and that was, of course, now 3 generations ago, Robert Kennedy Jr. Robert Kennedy. His junior is running for president, and of course Kennedy was killed in that assassination. Reagan and Trump were not. Of course, I have great sorrow for the deceased and thankful for law enforcement and the Secret Service. Republicans are blaming Biden. According to Mike Collins, a Republican from Georgia, he's saying that Joe Biden sent the orders, not literally, but figuratively. And Trump fans blame the media. If you were watching the footage, you could see they were giving the middle finger to a lot of the media. So this appears to have been a Biden supporter. He was registered Republican, likely to vote against Trump in the primary, which didn't end up happening. I'm not going to say his name because I'm not going to give him any more clout than he's already gotten, other than say that he is a 20-year-old male. Biden, at 8:15 p.m., gave a speech from Rehoboth, Delaware, in Rehoboth Beach, and I would say Biden sounded pretty good, actually. I'm not going to play the clip because I don't think that's necessary, but he didn't sound senile. Sounded pretty good. It was a short statement and it was prepared, so nothing super impressive, but he didn't stumble too much. The Trump and Biden campaigns are now on blackout. Advertisements have been shut off. This could be the end of open rallies, because this rally was held outdoors. There may have been a VP announcement at the rally that would have been planned, but it never came because of the shooting. Trump only spoke for a few minutes. So where do we go from here? Well, normally I would expect something like this to cause Trump to get support in the election. Because this happened super early on, if this had happened in October or early November, I would expect that this would really benefit Trump. But he might see a bit of a bounce in the polls, but I wouldn't anticipate it to last. We'll get into the polls a bit later, but I would be very skeptical of this dramatically changing the race in any way. That is all I have to say about that now. Keep in mind the RNC is beginning literally tonight. In fact, it's already begun, and we're going to have to follow what happens. As of this recording, we still do not have the Trump VP announcement. I'm going to put it out there. I think it's going to be Marco Rubio, but I don't know. We'll find out. It's possible that between the recording of this episode and the release of it, we know. I doubt it, but if that is the case, I'll put it in the description as an update. So, let's move on to the next topic, which is about the polling. I used 2 sources. Real Clear Politics, which is Real Clear Polling, as it's a separate division of Real Clear Politics. But I was looking back to January 1st, 2024, until now. I don't want to throw a bunch of numbers because it could be very difficult to understand, but very difficult when you're listening. But Trump has stayed within a range of 44.5% to 47.5%, and Biden's been in a range of 43% to 46.5%. So Trump's had a lead from the beginning of the year until now between 0.2 and 4.3. So from toss-up to slightly lean Republican. The last Biden lead was on September 11th, 2023, so that was 10 months ago. The trend is a narrow Republican lead nationally, which would mean to a Republican win. That is the trend. I try not to look at individual polls, I look at the overall trend, and that is what we are seeing. In July of 2020, Biden led by 8.5%, and in July of 2016, Hillary Clinton led by 4.5%. If we include Kennedy and Stein and West, who are the other independent candidates, the gap is from 5% to 0.9%. So we need a little bit of a stronger lead for Trump. And of course, Biden would have 35.6% to 40.8%. That's the range of averages. 4.3 to 42.8, and 5.2% of voters undecided. So it's basically a stagnant race, which is what we already know. If you remember a poll, I said 7 to 8% of Americans, according to CNN, I said this a couple weeks ago, have no opinion on either candidate. So it's really those few people who are going to make a decision. 538 has a very similar picture with a Biden lead of about 0.5% for about a week in June. Other than that, Trump has led. Kennedy has about 10%, although Kennedy has been falling. The approval of the two candidates have been pretty similar. The unfavorable rating, this is super important. So Trump's unfavorability rate, as of right now, is 53.7%, and his favorability rating is 41.6%, which is down 12%. That's a minus 12 approval rating. Biden's is 6.1% worse. So the unfavorability rating of him is 56.9. His favorability rating is 38.7, which is a deficit of 18.2, and it is dropping. So the Biden approval rating as of right now seems to be hovering around 37%, which is minus 19.5%. So I looked back at some old data comparing Biden to other presidents. In July of 2020, Trump's approval rating was 41 to 42%, and of course Trump lost. In July 2012, Obama's approval rating was about 46%, and he won. In July of 2004, Bush's approval rating was about 48%, and of course Bush won. In July of 1996, Bill Clinton's approval rating was 57%, and he won. In Bush Sr., July of 1992 is 32%, and he lost. And of course, it was actually, and get this, Bush's approval rating was 90% at the beginning of 1991. That was because of the success in the Gulf War. And just for good measure, Jimmy Carter's approval rating in July of 1980 was about 33%. Of course, Jimmy Carter also lost. So what's the message here? Biden's approval rating is slightly higher than Bush and Carter's was at the end, or at this point in their presidency. His is lower than Trump, so Biden is in the danger zone. He really needs an approval rating of at least 40%. He could probably get away with being a little bit lower than Trump's approval because Trump is so unpopular, but he needs it at least 40%. At this point, he's not going to win. That's all I have to say about polling. I don't like to talk about polling too much because that can be quite boring to some people. I always enjoy those numbers. I did want to say, though, there is a NATO summit, and there was a NATO summit in Washington. It was people were monitoring Biden, the media, people in Congress, foreign leaders. Foreign leaders are definitely hoping there will not be a second Trump term. He did a solo news conference on Thursday, and there was a rally in Detroit on Friday. Speaking of President Biden, at his news conference, he mixed up Zelensky and Putin. He mixed up Trump and Harris, which are regular bloops. I've done that kind of stuff before. We've seen this for years. I've known Biden wasn't really all there since at least the middle of June in 2021. The NATO press conference, I'd say, didn't go bad. However, at this point, Democrats are basically frozen. There's not much they can do. Jim Clyburn, who's a big Biden ally and endorsed him in the South Carolina primary in 2020, and that really delivered him the win, says he's still all in for Biden. However, he did leave the door open. And of course, Trump's statement on the matter was, despite all the Democrat panic this week, the truth is it doesn't matter who they nominate because we are going to beat them in a thundering landslide. Republicans, according to Politico, they're feeling very happy about this. Of course, they're very liberated. Nancy Mace said they finally get to walk in a pair of Republican shoes because Republicans feel like they're always the ones being mobbed. And actually, according to Nancy Mace, when she was walking out of the speaker's office, she said there were no Republicans, there were no media waiting to ask a question. They were all chasing after Democrats. So that's probably doesn't happen very often, I can imagine. Darren Van Orden, a Republican from Wisconsin, Derek Van Orden from Wisconsin said it's like poetic justice, and Doug LaMalfa from Republican California said Speaker Johnson invited us all to hug a Democrat today, so I actually hugged a few, which is kind of funny. And according to Fox, Republicans are letting Biden self-implode, which is a great distraction from intense infighting over the last 18 months among House Republicans. And of course, keep in mind there is still a federal budget that is due on September the 30th. So Republicans and Democrats will have to get together to work on that. So, the other thing I wanted to mention was it's kind of back to NATO. So the big thing of NATO allies are very worried about Trump returning because Trump has threatened to pull out of NATO, but that is impossible because that needs to be done with the approval of Congress. So Trump is getting so far what he wants from NATO as they are spending more on their own defense. Trump has always been saying Europe should defend itself, and I absolutely agree with that. David Lammy, who's the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, has met with the Trump team and Trump himself. And of course, the Trump team has met with ministers from Poland and Canada, and they're trying to shore up support with Republican governors. So far, 23 out of 32 members are spending at least the required 2% on GDP. And there's talks of shifting Ukraine aid from the USA to Europe. So this is, I would say, a great thing. Less money we're spending, more money we can spend here. Will it be spent wisely? I'm not sure. The only downside to this would be if Europe either doesn't pick up the ball, then Ukraine will be kind of left holding the bag, or we will lose more influence on the world stage. But if you ask me, that second option is worth it. The plan so far, from what we gather, is if Putin doesn't agree to negotiate, we're going to flood Ukraine with weapons, which from what I understand, we're kind of already doing that. And we're going to cut off Zelensky if Ukraine doesn't agree to talk with Russia. So that's probably the best deal that we can come up with to end the war. But of course, Trump is not going to say what his plan is specifically. And this is something I've wanted to mention for a while. We had the EU elections. If you don't know, the European Parliament, every 5 years, they elect an election, or they elect an election. They elect members of Parliament to decide the EU budget and big priorities at a continent-wide level. So the far right will make up a third of Parliament in the session, which will end in 2029. I wouldn't necessarily say it's just a rise of nationalism. I'm saying we are seeing an anti-incumbent surge. So, and I'll demonstrate that. In the UK, in their elections last week or 2 weeks ago, Reform UK, which is like the populist right party, received 14% of the vote. That's not that much different from other populist parties, like the UK Independence Party in 2015 got about 12%, 13%. The Labour victory may stall populism in the UK for now. Of course, Rishi Sunak is no longer Prime Minister, if you're not aware. So there is a new left of center government there. In France, the National Rally, while they were put in third place, they have way more support than they did before. The Prime Minister said he would resign in France, but instead, as far as I know, President Macron has rejected the resignation. And this is all happening right before the Paris Olympics. In Germany, they didn't have an election there, but they had the EU election. They didn't have a national election. The Alternative for Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany party, is in second place in the polls, with the center-right CDU in the first. The governing coalition in Germany is in deep disarray. So those are the national polls. Internationally, we're going to have to see. We've seen that the Alternative for Germany, which are far-right, they're anti-immigrant, anti-Europe, and they kind of want to see a more isolationist Germany. Of course, Europe has a deep, deep history with populism. That's something that they have a bigger problem than we do here. But that's something to keep an eye on, because European cohesion is very important to maintain peace in Europe. As you think about it, since the European Union was formed, there has not been, other than the Ukraine war, there has not been a major war on the continent. So, in Spain, which is not a member of the G7, but important to remember, the Vox party last year saw a surge in support, not enough to remove the to remove the socialist prime minister, but it was still, you're seeing this anti-incumbency brewing, especially in Canada. The Conservatives have been ahead since early 2022, and the governing Liberals are not far from being put in third place. It's about 5 to 7 points. So right outside the margin of error. In Canada, their election is due in October of 2025. However, get this, no minority government in Canada has ever lasted a full term this century. The last one was in 1968. So no minority government, that's when a prime minister is in office without a majority of seats, has ever lasted a full term. So that means I would expect an election in Canada either at the end of this year or beginning of next year. I highly doubt this will make it the entire term. And of course, in Italy, the Brothers of Italy party have been well ahead in the polls since October of 2022. They are the governing party. They were just installed, so there's not much of they are the anti-incumbents, even though they've been in power for almost 2 years. And of course, in the U.S., as we talk extensively, Trump is ahead in the polls. Biden's trailing in every swing state, and we're just waiting to see what will happen here. Is this a sign of what's to come? What's going on in Europe? Possibly. Of course, every domestic situation is different, but at this point, I would say yes, there is an anti-incumbent sentiment brewing, at least in the West, and I would be very wary if I was the Democrats. While I don't want to speak for Europeans, I do want to say what I've noticed is that a lot of Europeans do treat EU elections as kind of like a joke, as like a protest. So just because something happens on the European Union level doesn't mean that that's what's going on nationally. But it is strikingly similar when you can compare the results in the national polls. Of course, this is something I meant to mention for I think about 3 weeks. We just have been so busy and I've not been able to bring it up. One of the big issues of this campaign is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. Now, why is that a big deal? Because they are set to expire. The Trump tax cuts for individuals like ourselves are set to expire in 2025, which is just next year. So from what I understand, the last tax year that those tax cuts will apply to, if they are not extended, is going to be in 2025. So that's going to be up to Trump or Biden to extend the tax cuts. Trump wants to make them permanent. Biden wants to raise taxes on the middle class, or not on the middle class, on the rich, keep them for the middle class. So extending the whole thing, as of right now, would cost $4 trillion over X amount of years. We don't know that yet. All sides at this point are concerned about the deficit. The lobbyists have descended on Congress. They want the tax cuts to continue. Yet now versus 7 years ago, there are way more populist GOP reps now. So it is unlikely the corporations are going to get as good of a rate as they got. There's currently a 21% corporate tax rate. Biden wants a 28%. And every 1% it goes up will raise between $100 and $130 billion over the course of, I think, a year. So the budget forecasters are currently warning a $2 trillion deficit each year, and Congressional Budget Office has said that our interest payments will reach $1 trillion a year at this current rate. Many GOP representatives want to keep it the same, but if the Democrats win big in November, I would expect the tax cuts to continue, or tax cuts to end. So Biden wants it at 28%. Trump wants to keep it at 21%. Truthfully, a number in the middle would probably be better. But this is a big issue. We need to really consider our spending. While it's unlikely we're ever going to have no deficit, by the way, a deficit is the amount of money the amount of money that we spend extra than we bring in each year. Debt is the total number. Very important to know the difference. So our debt is about $34.5 trillion. The deficit is about $1.5 trillion. Get this, $1 trillion is worth, Elon Musk is super rich, which he is. It's about 5 times more expensive than he is. That's insane. So that's something that the next Congress is going to have to figure out. I would not expect anything to change before the election, but we do really need to consider raising taxes on everybody, not just the rich, because raising them just on the rich is not going to be enough. Of course, though, raising taxes usually slows economic growth. We really need to consider talk about spending in this country. A lot of people say taxes are too high. In fact, taxes are really too low for how much money we spend. We need to either consider cutting taxes, the other way around, lowering spending or raising taxes because what we are doing is unsustainable. We are expected to reach $90 trillion by the 2050s. $90 trillion. And people were freaking out when it reached $11 trillion at the end of the Great Recession. So that's something we really, really need to look into. And this is an issue I'm very passionate about. I know people do not like paying more in taxes, but we cannot afford to continue on the path that we've been going. I would expect major changes to Social Security either by the end of this decade or the beginning of the next. And I would also we can say that we're going to have to start continuing to look at the long-term consequences of what we're doing. Economics is good about telling you what will happen, but it is not good about telling you when it will happen. If we extend these tax cuts, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a UK 2022 style loss of confidence in the bond market. Basically what happened there was the Prime Minister Liz Truss proposed a budget where she would cut taxes across the board without a way of paying for it. That caused the UK to lose confidence, UK investors to lose confidence in the pound. The value of the pound plunged and the bond market collapsed. People did not want to buy UK government bonds. The Bank of England had to intervene to buy the bonds, which caused more inflation, and people have been stuck with higher mortgage bills ever since. So that's something we could be worried about. We might have to face here. So there are only three ways to pay for something. Either we can print money, which will cause inflation, we can raise taxes, which people don't like, or we can cut spending in other departments, which people also don't like. So I would recommend cutting spending and raising taxes because inflation is not a good thing, as we've seen. Inflation is like a cancer that eats at the bedrock of your economy, and it must be kept under check. Anyway, that is all I have to mention this week. Thank you for tuning in. It has been a momentous week. I do not expect another episode until Monday the 22nd, which is a week from now. And I hope you tune into the RNC. Next episode, we will probably be talking about that. If not, I have a special episode to release in place of that next week. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.